Welcome to the True Story London podcast. I'm Michelle Toth. In this podcast, we listen to a true personal story told live at one of our shows in London, followed by a conversation with the storyteller about their background, process, story themes, and more. Today's storyteller is Michaela Agapiou, sharing the story of when she, as a self-proclaimed non-sporty person, decides to take up taekwondo. In our talk afterward, we discuss the nature of belonging and achievement, being an emotional person and craving the same from others, and how she found and fell in love with storytelling. But first, let's listen to her story, recorded live in London.
Let's sign up for taekwondo. My housemate George, who I've known for all of 5 days, announces in our kitchen. It's the first year of university, and I'm supposed to be trying new things and making friends, so seems kind of efficient. It also seems a hell of a lot easier than going alone to the LGBTQ+ society events, which I want to go to, but feel kind of squirmy about, and I haven't told my flatmates I'm bi yet, and I want to, but I don't know if I need to, if I should, or how to. So, despite my flimsy and feeble limbs and a lifelong lack of enjoyment of any form of sport, I find myself signing up to a Korean martial art which specializes in kicking. And I don't expect to improve. I don't know if I'm really going to stick it out. I've never improved in any sport. At school, in the summer term, aka the athletic season, we had to do a weekly 3-minute run. And all of me and my friends, except for the one sporty one, would be at the back, dying, massaging our stitches, trying to think of excuses about how to get out of this next week. It was awful and shame-inducing. At the end, we'd have to gather around our teacher, and she'd read out our names and how far we'd run the week before. And then we'd have to call out in front of everyone this week's meterage. And my distance never improved across a whole term. But I'm there with George, barefoot and in our active wear, in a university gym room, which is really like a dance studio type with mirrors for one wall. There's a bunch of other new students, and then dotted around the room, there's people with a proper white dough box and a coloured belt. The class gets underway with a basic intro to punching, and it's fun. But I'm thinking, this must be so boring for the experienced people, and most of us aren't going to be here next week. But I am there next week, and the week after that, and I am totally in awe of the calm instructors, Master Iqbal and Mrs. Dunhaneath. They are teaching us kicks and punches, but there's never any aggression in them. There's just this calm assertiveness and this like real in-depth knowledge. So a couple of months in, and I'm not just flailing my legs around in some vague direction. I'm actually doing distinguishable types of kicks. And those regulars, they aren't bored going over the basics. When I'm paired up with the people who've been there for a couple of years, the blue belts and green belts, they're so patient and encouraging, and they seem to really enjoy giving us tips and tricks, and I really just feel like I'm one of them. Christmas rolls round, and I have my first taekwondo grading. I pass, and I'm filled with pride as I get my first belt. It's white with a yellow stripe around the middle, and my overachiever brain goes way into overdrive, and I can see exam to exam, belt to belt, and a black belt is totally achievable in the 4 years of my degree. I've got this. Now, in these classes, we didn't really focus on power. It was more on accuracy and technique. You know, if you hit someone too hard in class, you bought them a pint at the pub afterwards. But occasionally we were allowed to throw ourselves into things a bit more. And these things were these really chunky pads. They were like half my height and really thick to absorb the shock. I started to hate it when these pads were in the corner of the room because I found it so tiring holding them up. Yes, it was really fun learning that I could kick above my own head height, but it was inescapable that I was one of the smallest and weakest in the class when it came to holding these pig pads. We'd have to hold it in this L formation, and my arms would just start drooping as the round kind of went on. And sometimes when there was someone who was a lot bigger than me in the group, I'd start feeling really sick. And then there's this one class towards the end of the year, and I'm with 3 people who just dwarf me. And it's not long into my holding rotation with one of these big chunky pads that I start struggling and I start feeling sick because I'm no longer able to keep my hands close to my body. So every time there's a kick, my arms come away from me and crash back into me. So I'm effectively punching myself in my own gut. And so as I start feeling more sick, and I'm really tense trying not to throw up in class because no one's ever done that before, I'm thinking, what the hell am I doing here? I still can't do a push-up. I'm clearly always going to be that small and flimsy kid. I could never run further. Why did I think I could get stronger here? Why did I think I could belong here? I just didn't see it. And as I'm trying not to cry, because I don't want to cry and then have to tell them that I'm too weak to do this, I smile and encourage the others along like they always do for me. We get to the end of class, and even post-cool down, I'm still feeling nauseous and achy, and I know I need to ask for help. And so I don't know if Mrs. Dunhanif is going to have any answers for me that aren't just, I'm not good enough to do this anymore, but I guess I have a bit of hope. And so I go up to her, I tell her how I'm feeling really sick, and, am I doing something wrong? And okay, maybe my feet could be a little bit more stable, but she says, Michaela, if someone is kicking too hard, you can ask them to stop. And she pauses as I start frowning because this is not something that had occurred to me. My mind is being blown, and at the same time, I'm so skeptical of what she's saying. Like, can I really ask someone to do that and hold back and still belong in this class and not be ashamed? So I say, well, if I can put my full weight into things when other people hold this pad, it's not fair if they can't do the same for me. And she just goes, Michaela, it is okay for you to ask this. It is not okay for someone to ignore a request like that. If they don't understand, they should come to me or any instructor. And she has this really kind look on her face because she can see how close to crying I am. And it's that look, probably more than anything else, that tells me that it's true. I do have permission. I always did. And I always should, in and out of this class. And so it's still a work in progress, but when I feel that sense of discomfort, whether it's a physical discomfort and I have to tell someone I'm weaker than them, or it's an internal discomfort when someone says something inappropriate at work and I feel scared about addressing it, or it's simply going alone to an event I really want to go to, I feel a strength that I didn't have before, that has nothing to do with how far I can run or how high I can kick, but has everything to do with Mrs. Dunhanif and the spirit of those taekwondo classes.
Michaela, welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
It's so nice to see you. How does it sound hearing your story back?
Yeah, it's nice, but also emotional.
Yeah. It still makes you feel a little moved.
Yeah, it does, especially at the end.
Well, I was thinking about this too, because there's so much in this story about this idea of permission, of belonging, of achieving.
Yep.
I'm curious where you grew up, where all of this athletic shaming took place.
I grew up in London, and I went to an all-girls school. I think it's just that it felt like always two categories. There's just like the sporty ones, and then everyone else, like we are just supposed to hate it together.
Bonding.
You bond in disliking it. So there's no in between ground. You're either like really good at it or you hate it.
And this self-conception of you as kind of small and weak, do you think that's only entirely rooted in your stature and your strength, or does it come from your experiences of being put into a category?
I think it's also, I am the quieter one in a very large family. And so I guess there's like personality as well that's tied in with the being 5'2".
Oh, interesting. So do you have many siblings?
Yes.
And are you the youngest?
No, I'm in the middle/youngest. I have 2 sisters and a half sister and 3 stepsisters. So a lot of girls. And we all went to the same all-girls school.
That's a lot of estrogen. Yeah. That must have been an interesting way to grow up.
I mean, it's not just sisters, it's also many, many cousins and uncles and aunts and everything. I don't remember being bullied by my older sister, but they talk about how like my sister wasn't the biggest fan after 5 years of being an only child when I appeared. Now we're super, super close. So she is fully forgiven, but that was probably also part of the quietness.
So it sounded like you were trying to make a move to find your people at university.
Yeah, definitely. I think I was really ready to start university. I was really excited to be there. And I had worked really hard academically. I'd grown up in a very academic-oriented education and family, and the first year of university doesn't count. Well, at least it didn't when I was there. And it was the first time where it felt like I could just focus on making friends and settling in and enjoy that, as opposed to trying to balance social life with exams. Exams always felt like they really mattered and had a consequence to the next year's exams, whereas this was the first time I was like, yes, just enjoy. So saying yes to things I hadn't done was a part of that for sure.
Sure. So the first year of uni is just like a free pass? How does that work?
Yeah, I don't really understand why they do this, but I mean, this is really into the nitty-gritty of my degree.
Which was
I
what?
did biochemistry
Okay.
with a year working in between. Mm-hmm. And for that, you had to get a certain amount to do that year in industry, they called it. So there was like a low bar. It was an achievable goal without too much work.
So this theme of achievement and marking your progress seems to run through this story, but also other stories you've told in workshop settings. What is overachieving or what's achieving about for you? And can you trace it somewhere? And is it just who you are?
Yeah, I think a mixture of who I am as a person and what I got rewarded for a lot as a kid. I was very lucky to go to private school, and it meant I was in an environment that really rewarded learning and you could really excel there. And I did, and my parents really encouraged it. I really enjoyed it. I mean, the first thing I ever remember wanting to be was a mathematician when I was like 8 years old. I would ask people to like write down ridiculous sums and just try and beat other adults at doing them, like just for fun. I mean, I'm not talking like child genius levels or anything, but it was just fun. I don't know if I just started showing signs of it and was just always actively encouraged, but it just very naturally flowed an academic pathway.
And there's something about your stories, this one and others, where there's always this like inner train of thought. Like your stories are quite internal. There's a lot going on in terms of feelings and thoughts. And I'm just curious about what role story development and storytelling has played for you in making sense of your thinking and making sense of your feelings.
Well, first, from listening to podcasts endlessly, I worked in a lab and it is really, really tedious sometimes. And so listening to podcasts is how I'd get through the day. And it felt like a fun bonus. I got to work and also be entertained. And then when I found storytelling podcasts, I think it was just a Guardian article recommending different podcasts, and there was one for Risk, and I started listening and I just loved it. And I think I've always been a very outwardly emotional person and don't always feel like everyone else is. So listening to stories and people sharing their internal thoughts was just like amazing, because this is just what I want from everyone all the time. But even from strangers, it's great.
That's a pretty interesting statement, that's what you want from everyone all the time. I completely crave that from people. They want to talk about the news or football, and I'm like, but what about your innermost feelings and thoughts and dreams and hopes? Come on. And it strikes me as so interesting when people aren't into it. And then I just assume they're just not into it yet.
Yeah, but I think also one of the most fascinating insights I ever had into understanding how different people are is one time we had, as a lab group, like a resilience training thing. There was a scale on the whiteboard of 1 to 10, and the question was, how often do you think about your emotions? I put down a 9, really felt like I was a 10, but there might be someone else who thinks about it a little bit more than me. And then there was 2 of my lab mates who were still stood there. They were like, we don't understand the question. It wasn't even like they could put themselves on the scale. They didn't relate to the whole question as a whole. So
that's not so shocking, right? You're hanging out with all these scientists and people that wanted to be mathematicians from the time they were little, and you might have been a little bit of an outlier in general in your community.
Think so, yeah. In a way that I think provides a different dynamic to a team that I think people enjoy.
So I don't want to lose this thread of how your inner experience runs through this story and how much it informs the progression of the story, because it's how you're feeling about getting into the taekwondo group in the beginning, how you're experiencing the training and your progression, and then what you're experiencing in these critical moments where you realize that you're being overpowered.
Yeah. I sometimes find it really hard to be attuned to the inner voice of then as opposed to my inner voice now about what happened then, if that makes sense.
Those are 2 very different lenses.
Yeah. So I think great storytelling advice is focusing on real moments and events where you can, because I can definitely get carried away when thinking about story ideas of just wanting to tell a whole life story with 1,000 different threads. But that moment with Mrs. Dunn-Hanif is just one that has really stuck with me, and focusing in on thinking about why it did, which is a bit of added detail, the belonging and piecing together why has kind of come after the fact. But remembering the discomfort is just something that is strong in my mind of that time and that moment.
Perhaps because you were having so much physical discomfort accompanied by emotional discomfort. I think that helped make that moment powerful in the story. But I thought it was just so interesting how it was clearly a massive light bulb moment for you when I'm thinking about the moments leading up to the conversation with her, where you're really spinning. You're like, how did I ever think I could do this? I couldn't do it when I was a kid. Why did I think I could do it now? And why do I think I belong here? I mean, it was really layering on a lot.
Yeah, I think in those moments, I really do feel like I think lots of things at the same time. I also think it's like a classic, at least for me, response when something negative happens. Even like in arguments, it's like, this is exactly like all the times this person has done this thing to me. It all piles on in one place. Like those really intense negative moments take you back into just every parallel time that that exact behavior has happened before. So all at the same time, I am a child, and all the other many times I've been bad at sports or not belonged or I can't do it.
That, what some people might call a trigger, like that moment, like triggered you to all the times that this has happened, and maybe that you were still hurting from. If you let yourself go back to those moments, they would still bring up some amount of sadness or feeling of disconnection.
I think so. And I think maybe also not very resilient to not doing well at things. I had been rewarded for being academic and then focused on being academic. Everything else then just drops away, and I was not very exposed to not doing well at things and then carrying on and still going and getting better. It was always just focus on the things you're already good at and building on that.
And continuing to look outside of yourself for signs that you're good enough, like the progress or whatever it might be. That was another thing that kind of ran through some of the themes in the story, seeking that external validation. Am I right?
Yeah, I definitely always have a desire to fit in, which I guess then, and belong, which means seeking kind of the external validation for sure. But I think this might be one of the few times where I might have asked for help for fixing something as opposed to just letting go of it or shoving it to the side. And I wanted to carry on so much that is what made me go up. If I hadn't been having such a great time, I would have maybe just given up.
And then the culture created in that community, in that class, in that group was pretty extraordinary. Mrs. Dunn-Hanif and the other instructors really created that. And I'm wondering what you've taken away from that in the cultures that you're responsible for creating.
I think it is to be really explicitly welcoming and approachable. Because even though I knew they were incredibly nice and super respectful and super encouraging of everyone staying within the sport and enjoying it, despite all of that, it was so hard for me to go up and ask for help, and I was so scared to do it. And it's only because they were incredibly nice that I did go up. So being very explicit to welcome and bring other people in is something I definitely work on.
One of the many things I related to in this story was the appeal of learning a sport that was also self-defense. And prior to my taking up boxing, I just cowered. I just felt afraid of physical interactions that might have been threatening. And then over the years of becoming better and better at boxing, it just changed how I moved through the world. And I just think it's a wonderful thing for anyone to engage in, not because you're going to look for or participate in like some sort of like street altercation, but rather just that you can occupy space differently and have a different level of confidence.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge part of the lessons I've learned from doing taekwondo, and is part of the lesson that Mrs. Dunhanif was teaching me at the end of that story, that there are like multiple ways to be confident and take care of yourself. And as well as being like, I kind of allude to being like flimsy and feeble, but I'm also the clumsy one in my family. I drop things all the time, drop my phone in toilets, maybe like 4 or 5 times.
No!
I currently have a bruise on my leg. I don't know how I got it, but very, very clumsy. And so I often feel not in control of my body. Someone knocks something over in the house and then they're like, was that Michaela? Like, you hear a phone drop, it's probably me. Or if you hear someone fall up the stairs or down the stairs, it's probably me.
And it just hasn't changed. It's just who you are.
No, there were definitely times when I was a teenager where it got worse. Like, I went through a phase where I just couldn't judge doorways. I would just like knock my shoulders into doorways. And so having a sense of control that I could improve accuracy, it was just a huge surprise to me that this was possible. It carries through in other ways of confidence, for sure.
So there is a line you have in your story about the culture being one of calm assertiveness. That sounds like a really lovely goal for how to be in the world.
Oh, it was just when you see someone and you just know what they're about and that they're solid and they're there. It's just fascinating to me because I guess I don't feel like that. So I was very fascinated by them, and I still really admire that ability to just know what your power is, what your boundaries are, what your limits are, that knowledge.
And some of that translated to you.
Yes, but I still find it very hard.
What do you find very hard?
Just generally speaking up for myself or standing my ground and not always trying to be like harmonious and placating.
So is that a value you hold, to be harmonious?
Yeah, definitely. I think I come from a big family from 2 different cultures. So my mum is from Hong Kong and my dad is from Cyprus, and both have big families. And family structure and family cohesion is really important. In the Chinese culture, it's slightly more hierarchical, but both really, I grew up where you're always trying to make things work for everyone as best you can. And it's something that is really important to me. But I think sometimes I've learned how to do that is by pushing away the discomfort or ignoring discomfort and not speaking up when I'm uncomfortable or being pushed too much or too hard, and just kind of getting on with it and crying about it like 2 days later and getting upset then and making a big drama.
And it's so tough because sometimes it's exactly the right thing to do, which is to suppress and just like say, I'm not going to go into that right now. And sometimes it's the right thing to call it out or address it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you're kind of trying to understand what everyone else is feeling and everyone's thinking, and like, what's that person's mood? How's that person doing today? Like, This is
an incredible skill for life, though. Like growing up in a big family where you are attuned to lots of different people's needs and feelings and wants at the same time. Think about people who grew up in single child households. They do not get the same training. So how did you get into storytelling as this art form and organizing communities and performances?
My PhD program had this really great aspect where for 3 months you had to do an internship in something not related to your PhD. I wanted to go abroad. And then as I got into podcast, I discovered that there was a science storytelling podcast called Story Collider. And I really got into listening to that because that was marriage of these two things. Me as a scientist and also a big fan of storytelling and other scientists sharing their feelings.
And Story Collider is fantastic. There's so many fantastic stories.
So many. They've been going for like over a decade, I think. they have pretty regular shows in New York, and I was there visiting a friend, and there was a show that week which was perfect. My very patient friend had to sit with me while I stood up to go ask and then sat back down again, and then stood up and then sat back down again a few times. And then I eventually went up and asked them, do you have space for taking on an intern that I'll be paid for by my PhD program? Yeah, I just want to help out and learn more about the storytelling world. I'm a big fan.
They must have loved that. Because some interns are very expensive. Some free internships cost, oh my gosh, so much. But having you as an intern for Story Collider must have been a dream.
Yeah, they were very happy to have me on, and they've been really nice about the work that I did as an intern, which was mostly just listening to hours and hours of stories and then tagging them with different themes and topics for managing the whole archive that they had. So I just, again, got to listen to more hours of podcasts, which was great. I took part in one. That was the first time I took part in a storytelling show myself. And then also kind of seeing how the producers worked with me on a story was fascinating to see what they say and how they ask questions. And then seeing shows get produced over the time that I was there was really great. And I learned a lot from them. And then after I finished my PhD, they asked if I wanted to help set up a London show. So I've been doing that over the last couple of years as well, which has been really, really fun.
Oh, fantastic. And we'll include all that information in the show notes because I'm sure people would be interested in going to shows. So, Michaela, I love the realization that you always had permission to speak up. It was interesting to see how you naturally could think about how it applied, not just in class, but outside of class. And I'm wondering how that realization has carried through.
Yeah, I mean, it was important to me to add in that it is still a thing I'm working on and a thing that I encounter in lots of different ways, that whilst there's a story about taekwondo, I wanted to show how it impacts other things. It's not just about getting into sport. Something about the newness of that community and obviously belonging to many others that I've been in for a long time. It felt like, well, if I can do this here with people who don't know me nearly as much as people who've known me for 10 years or 20 years, people who've known me for much longer should also be accepting of those limits.
And the other thing is, even if they're not, you still have the right to assert. Even if they don't respect your limits or your boundaries, you still had that permission to say what they are.
Yes, and the kind of, well, that's on them part. I always want to see what I can do first to change as opposed to other people. So I think I often take on the assumption that I need to do something differently if I don't want this thing to go this way and I have to control it.
Control is exactly the word that was on the tip of my tongue. It looks like you're being the generous one, being the accommodating one. But sometimes what we're really doing is trying to control the environment so we can tolerate it.
Yeah.
And I think when we start to realize that we can tolerate it if someone doesn't respect our boundaries, I mean, within reason, there are obviously certain situations where the repercussions of someone not respecting your boundaries are much higher stakes and bigger deal. But we're talking about conversation. You always have the permission. You can speak up, and the person might not respect your needs or boundaries. And then noticing if you can handle it and checking the assumption that you ever couldn't handle it if someone didn't meet your needs or respect what you wanted. It can sometimes hold us back from saying out loud the expectation that we might not get what we need and that we might not be able to handle it. So then we stay silent. And can you test that assumption in a safe way? Say out loud what you need, even if you don't get back what you think you want. How can you be your own best resource or source of comfort? Because if you can start to pull the role that Mrs. Dunn Hanif plays in this story into your daily life and how you treat yourself, you can carry that kind of strength and that kind of compassion everywhere, always.
Yeah. And also, I guess, building up a little store or stash for yourself. And I mean, I guess one of the reasons why this story has stuck with me is I think about it a lot. I genuinely think about it before I'm about to do a scary thing and use that to go again.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting example from your life that other people might find helpful, which is, can you find the moments where you had breakthroughs or positive outcomes or were positively surprised? And as you said, cement them as memories so that they kind of go with you as part of your resilience, part of how you handle today's challenges.
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the people who keeps notes on their phones about nice things that have happened to keep going, or I don't remember to look at them that often, but
You know they're there.
I know they're there. I know
you took the time to type them up. But along that line, I think the overlap between reflecting on experiences and remembering them as stories and developing as humans, I think that overlap is really interesting. Like the places where the reflection process, the shaping process, the deciding why it's important, that self-reflection, applying it to new circumstances, I think that's an exciting aspect of storytelling.
I guess this is the thing that I really liked about storytelling when I was listening, is that it felt so accessible as a format of someone expressing themselves, whether or not you were someone with a performance background. You know, it's not like poetry reading things where your knowledge of words and language and playfulness has to be, you know, immense, or other longer form things. I think there's something about the shortness of 10 minutes that really suits people who don't necessarily have a performance or written language, fictional or non-fictional background. So as someone who had always just kind of thought of themselves as a scientist, there was something very appealing about the format that felt like anyone can share something about their lives. And I guess that's the thing that has drawn me in most of all, hearing other people do that where it's not their career.
Yeah, it's not their default way of orienting to the world, but they can still do it because it is so fundamental to being human. I love that part of it too. And when people have very science-oriented careers and they might default to sharing information in maybe a drier way or a more data-focused way, but they can figure out the narrative and how to create some amount of tension or conflict or to have some characters in their story. I mean, it could just be such a powerful way to express important scientific ideas or any kind of idea.
Yeah, and I also think the perception of what science is so different from doing science sometimes, because so much of science is really just pouring yourself into this thing that can sometimes be really a grind of repetition, and you can work for 3 months on something and it be completely useless.
Oh no.
You haven't designed it correctly and you've spent 3 months working on it.
There's drama.
You know, like people have, it's emotional when and you have people who have been training for years, who've been studying for years, and there are a lot of feelings about it. I think also there's a big vibe of individualism in science. You know, Nobel Prize winners, like there can only be maximum 3 people who win it, and the people who do, you know, they've had hundreds of people work on these individual things. But I think in stories you can get across who the people are a little bit more, and they're not just these geniuses over there or something. The thing I love about storytelling is being transported into someone else's world and the way they think and the way they feel in a situation that could be really, really different, but somehow connects on just like this really basic emotional level in some way. I love feeling connected to people who might be really different to me or in totally different situations.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story and letting us connect with you. It's been a real pleasure to chat with you about it and about stories.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information about today's storyteller and conversation, check out the show notes. The True Story London podcast is hosted by me, Michelle Toth. Our producer is Ellis, Ballard. Our theme music is by Sea Noise. Live recordings were provided by Laughing Around and recorded at 21 Soho. More information about our live shows and workshops can be found at truestorylondon.com. And just one more thing. If you haven't already, please subscribe or follow and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. It really does help us to reach more people. Thanks, and we'll see you for another episode soon.